Apologies for the delay. We had some technical issues here with Kevin. We are restarting this live event. So, for anyone that's joining us live, please make sure you have your questions ready for Kevin Parker. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us. So, Kevin Parker is currently Director of Product at wikiHow, which is a trusted how-to site on the internet. You can go on and Google anything on there if you need to know how to do things. Kevin started off his career in healthcare as a biomedical engineer. He then went on to be a co-founder of a health and fitness startup and found his way into product management. Hopefully we have some time to ask him questions about that. But today he's talking to us about mindfulness in product management. I am very curious as to how you were able to be director of product for three different companies. And I'm sure there's a lot of mindfulness and values that you brought to that. So, very excited for your presentation today. And again, my apologies for the technical difficulties with the live broadcast.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hen, for the intro. Very glad to be here. I'm a big fan of PMHQ. I used to be very active in the Slack channels when I was just getting started in product. But yes, so today we're going to talk a bit about mindful product management. This is a bit of a non-traditional discussion about products. I've been working in product for over 10 years, but I also have a whole bunch of training in meditation teaching, mindfulness teaching. And I've found that it can be incredibly valuable to bring the two together, both in terms of getting better outcomes for our users and our companies we work for, but also for ourselves. So with all of that, let's dive in. So at the start, I just want to take a moment and define what is product management at a very high level. So I simply view product management as paid problem solving. We are problem solvers and decision makers. Ultimately, whatever the company needs done to get the product to where it needs to go, that is what the product manager has to do. And most of the time, that involves making very, very impactful decisions. And with those decisions comes a whole lot of communication. In fact, I would kind of chalk up 80% of product management to communication. So if that's product management, what is mindful product management? Well, we had a few modifiers. Mindful product management is just not solving any problem. In fact, it often involves ignoring a lot of problems and solving the right problems. You have a limited number of resources, you want to be very judicious. It involves solving those problems gracefully, which not only means keeping all of your stakeholder needs in mind, but being very aware of how you're communicating with your engineers, your designers, your users, other PMs. These are going to be people that hopefully you are building long-term relationships with, and you want to solve problems in a harmonious fashion. It also means making ethical decisions. And I don't necessarily mean the really obvious ones of, hey, don't build products that hurt people, but also less obvious ones, such as how are you leading your users into places that make sense for them? Are you setting them up for success? When they take an action in your product, is it going to do what you've led them to believe it's going to do? How do you act towards your coworkers? Do you support them not only just within that company, but in their own growth? All of this is part of being a good product manager. And then finally, communicating with empathy. If I were to honestly just stop the presentation right here, that's what I would stop on and say, hey, if you want to become a better product manager, get a few books on empathetic communication and just do that. It's not just going to help you build products that are more effective, but it's going to help you honestly just get things done within your organization, because it's going to enable you to connect better with the people you're working with. So you might have noticed in all of that is that every one of those things are soft skills. At no point am I talking about, hey, you need to be able to write really good specs, you need to understand code or something like that. Those are very, very valuable things, but they can be taught and they're relatively straightforward. I can get just about anyone to write a decent spec in a few hours. That's not what I look for when I'm hiring a product manager or working with one. What I look for is these soft skills, because these are the same skills that you're going to be practicing in your real life. So if I think that you're showing up with empathy, showing up gracefully, caring about your coworkers, and also being very proactive and very detail-oriented and thinking critically, it's probably because you do that the other 16 hours when you're not here at work as well. And so those things are going to be very ingrained. Whereas it's going to be hard for me to fight against that tide if you don't have those soft skills. So I always advise younger product managers, and honestly every product manager, to invest in the soft skills as much as possible. And so how do we do that? How do we bring these soft skills to the workplace? And how do we do it in a way that's unique to us? And so this is where values come in. And values-based living is something I talk a lot about. It's something that can feel weird to bring into the workplace, especially at first. But basically, I view values like user needs, but for yourself. When you're building a product, you have a whole set of requirements that you're building to, and sometimes things can get confusing, requirements conflict, and you're not sure what to do. So what's the next step? Well, you go look at your user needs and you figure out what those essential North Stars are telling you to do. That's what your values do for you, but they are essentially, instead of defining your product, they're defining how you show up in the world and how you show up at work. So a simple way to go about this is to start by identifying what your three core values are. And you may have some in mind already. That's cool. If you don't, that's okay too. This is the kind of thing that, just like any product, you'll iterate over many times to get right. So for myself, for example, my core values are authenticity, vulnerability, and empathy. And I do my best to bring these to my workplace. That can be very scary, especially if you are not very experienced with doing that. And so what we try to do and we want to do is find small ways to actualize our values and then scale up over time. So for example, a very small way would be changing the way you show up in your 10-minute Scrum meetings to be more in line with your values. Or if empathy is a core value of yours, trying to go out of your way to practice that in your communication with your coworkers. And then as you get more comfortable, you scale that up. And so I'm going to give a few case studies, essentially, of how my own values have showed up in my work and also how those have affected my career. So the first one is what I like to call war profiteering. So at the end of my consulting career, I was consulting as a project manager for about 5.5 years. I found that, so I didn't necessarily get to choose what products I was working on. Basically, and our biggest ticket customers are the ones that I would end up taking. And I found that I was spending all of my time between two different products. 50% of my time was going towards a very large, big tobacco brand name, and 50% of my time was going towards a healthcare startup. And I hated this. This was not in line with my values. I jokingly call it war profiteering. It did not feel good to be doing work that wasn't aligned with how I wanted to show up in the world. And so after a few months of this, I left my consulting job and I joined the healthcare company full time. And yes, I could have joined the big tobacco company instead, and I also could have gotten paid that way. But honestly, I've found that the more that I have followed my own values, the more I've been compensated, the better my career has gone regardless. And so a really good example of this is also just connecting with other humans. And so you may have heard of Naval Ravikant. He's very big on Twitter, and he was one of the co-founders of AngelList, and he tweets all the time and has books written about him and talks about how to live a happy life. He has a lot of things to say about philosophy and also how to be successful and get rich and all of these things. And one of the slogans he says is, play long-term games with long-term people. There's also something implied here. You have to be a long-term person yourself. And so what does that mean? Well, it means showing up authentically, being willing to be vulnerable with other people, and investing in them. And so this showed up in my own career in a very big way. I currently am the director of product at wikiHow. I interviewed at wikiHow about 2 years before I actually took this job. And what had happened is I'd gone through the end of a very long, a literally 20-step interview process. And at many steps along the way, I had some very long, in-depth discussions with wikiHow's CEO. These are fantastic discussions. And by the end of it, I chose to join another company. And so the CEO came to me and she said, hey, I understand that you're making this choice. I understand why you're making it. I want to stay in touch, and I mean that, and I'm open to being a mentor for you. And so that's what we did. For 2 years, she became a mentor of mine who coached me through dealing with challenges at the company that I had chosen to join instead of hers. And so what was the result of that? Well, we kept investing in each other. And then when the stars aligned, it made all the sense in the world for me to leave that other company and join wikiHow. And I had no uncertainty about this decision because I knew that I was playing a long-term game with a long-term person. And I can also say that this is hands down my favorite job I've ever had. It's absolutely amazing. So bringing your values to these kinds of situations and being open to making real connections with people, this stuff really does work. One more example I'm going to give, and I'm going to take a moment to brag about something we've recently done at wikiHow that I'm very proud of. So we've started building quizzes at wikiHow. wikiHow is a very well-known how-to website. It's the largest how-to website on the internet. And we started branching out into quizzes. And one of the quizzes that we wanted to try out some sexuality-based quizzes. And it's very sensitive content, and we wanted to be very thoughtful the way we went about this. And we were looking at quizzes on the internet that were "Am I gay?" quizzes. And there's a lot of these out there, and a lot of them are kind of fun, silly interactions. But we also noticed that a lot of them tended to hypersexualize people that were searching for them and tended to be very crude in the way that they discussed the content. And so we set out to create this quiz that, yeah, it would be kind of fun and have some entertainment value, but it would respect the fact that a lot of people searching this content were teenagers who were questioning their sexuality and really needed legitimate help. And so we involved a LGBTQIA+ social worker to make sure all of the content was very thoughtful and empathetic. And at the end of the quiz, regardless of whatever results you got, we would always make sure that it made it clear that you have a right to be affirmed no matter what, nothing's wrong with you, and that also we are a quiz. We can't really tell you who you are, and then we point you to very authoritative and helpful resources such as TrevorSpace that can. We don't get any money, or not can, but that can help you more than, say, a how-to site can. And we don't get any money from that. We don't have any partnerships with them, none of that. We're sending traffic away from our site because it's what our users need. And in turn, we have found that we have suddenly risen through the rankings in Google. And if you search "Am I gay?" or "Am I gay?" quiz, it's going to be one of the top hits. And so this is an example where we really wanted to be very sensitive and understand what our users were going through and to try to really help them. And in turn, our users have helped us. So to wrap this up, I want to get a little bit tactical. So how can we do this? How can we bring values to our careers? How can we bring them to the workplace? So the first step is, of course, figuring out what your values are. Choose a few that sound good. Honestly, it's not too important because it's like building a product. You're not going to get it right in the first try. And then you have to do the very painful step of assessing how well your behavior is aligned with your values. That one's going to be difficult because it doesn't always align. And then you start prototyping new ways of showing up and ways of essentially wearing your values on your sleeve, letting others be able to see and tell what your values are without you simply saying, "Hey, this is my value." And then just like any other product, iterate, keep going through this, keep trying to find better ways to bring your values into the workplace. And then finally, just a few general mindful tactics. These are kind of principles that I use honestly in my life in general, but also at work. So the first is default to compassion always, especially if you're, say, a product manager at a startup where things can get very stressful. Most of the time, people are trying to bring their best selves to work, and sometimes things don't come out right. That's fine. As much as possible, always default to compassion, always give people the benefit of the doubt. You're never going to regret being kind. Invest in your coworkers. Remember, just like you, they're people. And just like you, they would love if they could actually bring their full selves to work and not have to pretend they don't have emotions. So make sure that you are taking the time to invest in them as people. And also, and honestly, this is a really big one for newer PMs, be open with your insecurities, especially when they're coming into play. One of the fastest ways to piss off an engineer is to pretend you understand the technical concept that they're talking about. But people aren't going to expect you to be an expert on everything, especially if you're just getting into a discipline, and it humanizes you. So as much as possible, just be open when you don't know things or you're afraid that you might be doing the wrong thing, and others will help you. And then finally, set very clear expectations. And what I mean by that is there's the obvious things of your product should set clear expectations with your users, but also make it clear what your boss should expect from you. Make it clear what you expect from your coworkers and what they can expect from you. Buddhism tells us that we suffer when our expectations are not aligned with reality. So you always want to make sure that everyone's expectations are in fact aligned. And then throughout all of this, just relax. Everything's going to be okay. This is, I think the biggest thing and the biggest piece of advice I would give my younger self, and I would give myself today, is just relax more. It's going to be okay. And so with all of that, if you want to kind of learn more about any of this stuff, I talk a lot about this on Twitter. I generally tend to talk about just values-based living in general on Twitter. You can follow me at Kev Packer. If you have questions, my DMs are open. And a friend of mine who is also a product manager and also a meditation teacher, her name is Upasana Gautam. She also talks about a lot of these same concepts and tends to focus more specifically on product management and remote working. So I also encourage you to join her. And with that, if we have a bit of time left over, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Kevin. I think I really resonated with the story where you were interviewing at one company, and then you became a mentor, and then 2 years later wasn't, I don't know, maybe it wasn't the right time for you. It became a better place for you to work with. So that's amazing. In terms
Yeah, and it's one of those things where so our CEO, her name's Elizabeth. Elizabeth and I, we both could have put up shells and been like, oh, this person didn't want to work here, so right, they don't exist anymore. Like the kind of things that people tend to, the fronts that people put up when they do this kind of thing. And I'm too old to be doing that anymore. And we both just decided to be humans, and she certainly didn't like my initial decision, but she showed who she really was in the way that she then supported me and made it clear that it was the most obvious decision in the world for me to then come to wikiHow.
Yeah, and again, going back to showing compassion, which is one of the first things to do, that's clear here, where she definitely showed compassion to you, for you to go about the way you want to go about in terms of your professional career. So that's amazing to see and hear.
Yeah, and it really is. It sounds a little like wishy-washy, but the world does reflect the energy that you put out there. And the way that it does that is because people are seeing how you're showing up, and it encourages them to show up similarly. So when I started being more joyful and more kind and going out of my way to connect with people, suddenly I started thinking like, wow, everyone else is doing this too. Did we all read the same books? Did we all start meditating? But just that we're all feeding off of each other. So it is kind of a cool upward spiral that you can sometimes engage in.
Yeah, very nice. I do have more questions for you, but again want to open it up to the audience. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type in the chat box. My question for you is, not a lot of people, I guess, are mindful, especially companies. That's a newer approach to the way people just go into their professional career. What do you recommend for those who are interested in mindfulness? How do they combine it when there's like that wall?
So yeah, there's so many ways to get at this. And especially if you're coming at this from a perspective of like, hey, I really need to see this have external results for me, that can be okay. It's just that then we need to kind of connect those things. And so one of the things, so I've been meditating for a long time, and meditation didn't really click for me until I kind of found the right analogy and could start seeing it in action. And what I started to realize is that it's like I sit down, I meditate, and I try to clear my mind. My mind wanders, I bring it back. My mind wanders, I bring it back. And what I realized is that this was a mental gym. And every time my mind wandered, that was like performing a rep and strengthening my mind. And what I then realized is that my mind was supposed to wander, because if it didn't, I wouldn't actually build the skill of being able to drop thought patterns. And the reason why that then became relevant is I started practicing that when I was at work, when I was in meetings. And this is what I would actually really recommend people do, is try to do this when you're in a work setting. So let's say you and I are in a meeting and I say something that pisses you off, that maybe I've made an offhand comment that I might have meant nothing from it, but you're thinking that this is implying that you did a poor job at something. There's going to be all sorts of subroutines firing off in your mind and a lot of defensiveness that's going to come in. And the question is, can you become aware of that? And can you just drop it? It doesn't matter if it's true or not. We don't need to analyze it, but can you just let it go and then think about another way, another more compassionate way to respond? And that's really, really hard to do. I'm not saying this is easy. What I am saying is, like anything else, it gets better with practice. And so if you want to make the mindfulness stuff work for you, you have to bring it to the workplace and get your reps in.
Yeah, I love that analogy, and very practical, very useful, because it's very hard, like you said, to kind of detach from that mindset in the moment.
Yes, and no one is enlightened all the time, and everyone trips up, and that's totally fine. That's just part of being human.
You talked a lot about empathetic communication, and you mentioned that there's many books on it. Can you give an example, like, of what empathetic communication doesn't look like and what it looks like, just so we have like a little frame?
Yeah, there's a lot of really good frameworks for this. There's two books that I recommend a lot. The first is Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. This one is typically read by people who are working through like relationship issues. And the way nonviolent communication works is that you are very careful to only state what is actual reality and to not embellish anything. And it can be very difficult to do. So I remember there was an example of like a mom talking to her son, and she said, like, "You always leave your socks all over the place, and it makes me angry." And you're like, okay, that was not a good way of communicating that. Maybe you could say like, "Hey, I noticed that there were a few times this week where this happened. And when this happens, I feel like my house is disorganized. How can we change the way this is going on?" And it's basically, it takes a lot of mental processing at first to communicate that way, but you want to be very careful not to put anything on someone, because once you do, they're going to get defensive. The other book that I recommend very strongly is Never Split the Difference. This book is super cool. It's written by a former FBI hostage negotiator, and it applies to so many situations, but he provides tactics, and his is very tactical. It's like, okay, you're dealing with a difficult person. How do you do this? And he has a bunch of specific skills that he gives, but one of them is mirroring. And so mirroring, and also actually, I guess the one I use more is it sounds like, it feels like statements. So basically you're trying to demonstrate that you are listening to someone by rephrasing and pitching back to them what they're telling you. So if, let's say in that previous example that I had said something that made it sound like you didn't do a good job with your project, you might say like, "Hey, it sounds like you're not happy with the way this project went. Can you tell me more about that?" And basically, when you do this, you are giving the other person space to fully express themselves, and you're kind of implicitly communicating, "I care about what you're saying. I'm not trying to combat you and be right. I want you to be able to fully express yourself." And there's a lot of nuance to it, and it is one of those things you have to practice a lot. But those two books, I actually once used Never Split the Difference to negotiate a contract that might have otherwise led to my company doing layoffs, previous company. So it actually, this stuff is very important.
Wow. Oh, no, that's pretty awesome. I love his book, Chris Voss's book. So yeah,
Yes.
it's just hard to implement, like you said, in the moment. You really have to be very mindful to do it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, and the difficulty with Twitter, particularly with something like self-improvement areas of Twitter, is that we will read these things, and then we'll get this little dopamine hit, and our mind will tell us like, "Oh yeah, I did the thing, but you didn't do anything." And that is also how most of us really kind of engage with books. That's how we read. We read a book like, "Oh, I feel really seen in this book," and then maybe we sort of try it out a bit, but like, I'm a product manager. At the end of the day, we have to get external results. And a lot of it just comes down to doing as much as you can, just practicing. And the fear is going to come in, and you do it anyway. And eventually your comfort zone expands. And like I said at the end of my presentation, everything's going to be fine.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess that's another key point, is just relax and just go in the moment and let go of any judgment or any of that, and be mindful and be present.
Yeah, it's like, and this is another Buddhist thing of like, we want to experience actual reality as much as possible. And when you're not relaxed and you have all these defense mechanisms firing, and I've experienced a lot of anxiety in my life, and I've seen how that basically I craft my own internal world that no one is in and also isn't real, but all these things are happening in it. I'm processing all this extra stuff. And then what someone else sees on the outside is a guy who's just not reacting to reality in any reasonable way. And so as much as possible, it's like, God, it's like the old quote that the only thing to fear is fear itself. But that is the thing. And that's why we do meditation. That's why we practice mindfulness.
And one more question on values. It sounds like you have, sorry for the loud noise, but it sounds like you've gotten to a point where your values, you've identified them and now you practice them and now you're living them, especially with career. Um, and you mentioned the steps into how to go about that, but any like advice or tips for people like just starting out in doing that, like what would you recommend them doing besides just or more than what you stated before?
Yeah. So to get started with it, man, this goes all the way back to Mark Manson's like original big book, like The Subtle Art. And he talks a little bit about what a good value is and what a bad value is. And I actually really like starting from that point. And a good value is essentially, it is something that is internal to you. So I can't value being the most popular person in the room because someone more popular can walk by and now I've failed, right? And it should be something that is aspirational. You can never achieve it. I can't value having $10 million. I might be able to value financial freedom. Maybe that's a thing I could value, but that's a little bit, maybe that's a little too specific too, if I really be honest. But so you want to be ideals that you strive for. And an exercise that I often recommend to people, and I've been trying to get this all written up to be a little clearer for everyone, is write down a list of people who you really admire. They can be people you know, you don't know, they can be fictional characters. And then for each person, write out characteristics of that person that you really admire in them. And then go throughout that list and circle characteristics that you really want to, that you personally want to have. And you're probably going to start finding patterns among those people. And within those, you'll find a good starting set of values.
Yeah, I like that exercise. A very practical tip. um, can you answer one question from the audience member?
Yes, I actually love talking about imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
So the first thing I would say is that if you're feeling imposter syndrome, that is a good thing. I don't know any authentic person who doesn't feel imposter syndrome. I feel it all of the time. And I like to use a mental reframe for how I approach this. Imposter syndrome is a little like how I relate to fear. It's once we accept that it's not going away, I review it as a friend. I view it as a friend. Basically, this friend is going to be with me for the rest of my life. And when I'm feeling this towards something, like let's say I'm feeling it imposter syndrome about whether or not I should be saying anything about product management, I view that as a friend pointing in that direction, saying, "Hey, keep going in that direction. You're on to something." And that's not necessarily going to be a silver bullet, but you are in good company. As much as possible, I would say, I'm going to go back to the previous thing of try to relax and try to understand where your own imposter syndrome is coming from and where your own anxiety comes from. So for me personally, what I eventually realized is that a lot of the anxiety that I have felt throughout my life is because I was not trusting myself to be able to handle certain situations. So I was telling myself, hey, you're an imposter. You don't know how to handle this thing. So I'm going to think of 1,000 different ways things could go wrong ahead of time so that I don't trust you in the moment. And you got to get your reps in and going in the other direction. So you have to feel that voice and choose not to feed it. And I know that's very difficult to do, but just keep practicing it and remember that we all experience that thing.
Yeah. And going back to what you said earlier, compassion, compassion, compassion.
For yourself as well. Yes, absolutely.
Other question, when you are interviewing for a job or when you are hiring employees, what kind of questions do you use to ascertain if their values align with yours?
Ooh, so I'm not sure if I'm the right person to ask this, because I will just ask people what their values are, and I'll usually ask them what their personal values are, because I don't care what they say the organization's values are. Every organization has like a mission statement. It doesn't matter to me. So this is how I've approached dating too, which is really fun. It's like, so what are your values? But what you can ultimately do if you don't feel comfortable coming out and saying that is you kind of got to read between the lines. And what I would actually do ahead of time is think, okay, these are my values. What would it be a situation in which this value would come into play? And then kind of ask them about that situation without being, too upfront about the value. So you could think about empathy, I suppose. Actually, this is one I do a lot when I'm interviewing people. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how much empathy they have. And I'll talk about previous conflict that they have had. How do you approach conflict? Tell me about a time when you were wrong and how or when you made a mistake and that upset someone who was rightfully upset. What did you do and how did you rectify that? Most people who have this value top of mind will immediately be able to give you some sort of story. So that can be a signal. The thing that I would the caution that I would give is, you will have other urges in you that push you in directions that are not in the direction of your values. Usually this will be in terms of like short-term dopamine hits, or, oh, this person wants to pay me a lot of money, something like that. And you really have to resist that siren song. And one of the ways I do this is once a week, every Sunday, I'm checking in with my values and seeing how my behaviors and decision makings are aligning with it. So I kind of went all over the place there, but I hope that helps a little bit.
Very helpful and lots of practical advice in this talk. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. I know we're a little over time. We started late. Sorry for the technical issue, but this was very helpful, very practical, and I hope people get to use this even more.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love doing this.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening, day, everyone.